The cold February wind swept through the Kasserine Pass as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stepped out of his command car and raised his binoculars. Below him lay the narrow valley that would soon become the scene of one of the most humiliating moments in the young history of the U.S. Army in North Africa. He had fought the British for years. He had outmaneuvered them, bled them, and forced them into desperate defenses. But the Americans? He knew little about them, only that they were new, inexperienced, and untested. That morning, as the first artillery shells flew, Rommel realized just how inexperienced they truly were. American lines were thin, scattered, and confused. Units withdrew without orders. Trucks clogged the roads. Soldiers, some barely in their 20s, fired wildly into the hills, unsure of where the enemy actually was. The German and Italian tanks pushed forward almost effortlessly, breaking through roadblocks that looked hastily built and poorly placed. From Rommel's vantage point, it didn't look like a battle, it looked like a collapse. A captured American officer later admitted that his men had never seen a German tank before that day. Rommel wasn't surprised. Everything he saw through the dust and smoke confirmed his early assessment. The Americans were poorly prepared for real desert warfare. As the Axis forces advanced, they overran command posts, seized depots full of untouched supplies, and scattered battalions that had barely had time to dig in. Radios buzzed with panic. American artillery retreated before they could fire more than a few shells. Rommel's staff officers exchanged glances of disbelief. "This is not an army," one muttered. "It's a training camp." But Rommel, ever the professional soldier, did not smile. What he saw did not bring him joy. It brought him caution. As he watched the Americans flee through the pass, leaving tanks burning and guns abandoned, he noticed small things, things most commanders would miss. Some American units, despite being surrounded, kept fighting with stubborn determination. A machine gun crew held their position long after the infantry around them had broken. A group of engineers destroyed a bridge under fire, slowing down his tanks. And in several positions, the Americans regrouped with impressive speed. Rommel lowered his binoculars. "They lack experience," he said quietly. "Not courage." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the Atlas Mountains, he spoke to his staff. "These soldiers will learn, and when they do, they will be dangerous." Kasserine Pass had shown him two truths at once. The Americans were unprepared, but they were not weak. Their equipment was strong, their logistics unmatched, and their spirit unmistakably fierce. They had been humiliated, yes, but humiliation was a teacher, and Rommel knew exactly what kind of enemy they could become once they understood the rules of desert war. That realization, more than the victory itself, stayed with him. He knew this defeat would not break the Americans. It would forge them, and soon they would return, stronger than before. After the disaster at Kasserine Pass, the desert wind carried more than dust across the American camps in North Africa. Carried shame and anger. Soldiers sat beside burned-out trucks, helmets in their hands, replaying the chaos again and again. Commanders walked silently through what remained of their units, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on their shoulders. No one needed a lecture. Everyone knew the truth. They had been beaten badly, but defeat didn't break them. It woke them up. Within days of the battle, the U.S. Army began one of the fastest transformations in its history. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, stunned by the scale of the failure, ordered sweeping changes. New commanders were brought in, tough, unforgiving men who had no patience for excuses. The most important of them was General George S. Patton, a storm in human form whose arrival felt like lightning hitting the desert. Patton didn't wait. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for opinions. He rebuilt discipline with the force of a hammer. He ordered soldiers to shave daily, keep their uniforms sharp, and maintain their weapons like they were sacred. He insisted that trucks be organized, roads be cleared, and communication lines be flawless. At first, many soldiers thought he was obsessed with details. But Patton knew the truth. An army that cannot handle small things will crumble in big battles. Alongside him came new tactics. American units trained relentlessly, practicing maneuver warfare against mock German forces. Artillery crews drilled until they could set up and fire in minutes. Tank crews practiced gunnery, coordination, and rapid advances. Infantry squads learned to attack, withdraw, and support armor with precision. Officers who failed were replaced. Those who succeeded were promoted quickly. The Americans also studied their enemy. Captured German reports were passed around, highlighting what Rommel admired and what he mocked. He said they were brave but unorganized, determined but inexperienced, strong in numbers but clumsy in execution. So the U.S. Army fixed every flaw the enemy had noticed. Logistics was strengthened. Ammunition deliveries became faster. Fuel convoys were protected. Field hospitals grew more efficient. Radios were standardized so every unit could talk to the next. What had once been a scattered force began moving like a single, coordinated machine. And something else began to change: the soldiers themselves. Those who had fled at Kasserine now trained with a fire burning inside them. They ran farther, shot better, thought faster. The humiliation of defeat had hardened them. The fear they once carried turned into determination, and determination turned into confidence. They wanted another chance, not to prove themselves to their commanders, but to prove something to the Germans. By late March, even Rommel's intelligence officers noticed the shift. "These are not the same men we faced at Kasserine," one report warned. And they were right. The U.S. Army that emerged from those weeks of rebuilding was disciplined, aggressive, and ready. What had been broken was reforged, not slowly over years, but almost overnight, under pressure, under scrutiny, and under the shadow of a legendary defeat. Kasserine Pass had bruised them, but it also transformed them. When the Americans finally moved forward again, they did so not as rookies learning war for the first time, but as a new force, sharper, faster, and more dangerous than the Germans had expected. When Rommel returned to the front weeks after Kasserine, he expected to face the same opponent he had crushed so easily. He knew the Americans had men, machines, and supplies, but to him they lacked the one thing that mattered in war: experience. He believed they would break again. But the soldiers he faced now were not the same men who had scattered in panic at Kasserine Pass. As Rommel's armored columns pushed forward across the Tunisian plains, his scouts reported something unusual. American positions were no longer sloppy or exposed. Their supply lines were guarded, their artillery was positioned with purpose, and their tanks were dug in rather than left out in the open. There were patterns, layers, signs of planning, the fingerprints of a rebuilt army. Rommel frowned at the reports. He didn't trust them. "Americans don't change this fast," he muttered. But they had. The first clash came near El Getter. Rommel deployed his veteran Africa Corps, men hardened by years of desert fighting. Their panzers rolled confidently toward what they assumed was another scared American line. Soldiers joked inside the turrets, expecting an easy victory. Then the desert exploded. American artillery, the same guns that had been so slow and disorganized at Kasserine, now fired with ruthless precision. Shells rained down in perfect intervals, walking across the desert like steps of steel and fire. Rommel's tanks halted, shocked by the accuracy. He was more shocked when the artillery didn't stop. It intensified. These weren't random bursts. This was a coordinated barrage, controlled by forward observers who tracked every German movement and called in fire with a calmness that hadn't existed weeks earlier. Rommel instantly understood. The Americans had learned. When the barrage ceased, American tank destroyers emerged from their concealed positions. They waited until the Germans were close, then struck with deadly ambush tactics the U.S. Army had adopted after studying German manuals. German panzers burned one after another. Rommel watched the battlefield through his binoculars, silent. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chaos. This was discipline. For the first time, he felt the presence of something dangerous, an opponent that adapted faster than he expected, that absorbed a defeat and used it as fuel, that rebuilt itself with astonishing speed. His staff officers rushed to him, asking for orders, but Rommel kept staring at the unfolding fight. "These are not the same Americans," he finally said. "We face a new enemy now." What stunned him the most wasn't their firepower. He already knew America could build anything. It was their will, their refusal to break, their ability to come back stronger after humiliation. In the following days, every German assault met coordinated resistance. Defensive lines placed with mathematical precision. Artillery barrages that shifted instantly. Infantry units moving with purpose, no longer panicking. Tanks positioned for counterattacks, not retreat. Rommel began referring to them privately as the New Americans. He realized something that chilled him more than the Allies ever knew. If the United States could learn this quickly, adapt this effectively, and fight with this level of rising skill, then the war in North Africa was already turning. And for the first time since arriving in the desert, Erwin Rommel understood he was no longer the hunter. A new foe had emerged, sharper, stronger, and ready to challenge him at every turn. The battles that followed El Getter marked a turning point not only in the North African campaign, but in the way Field Marshal Erwin Rommel viewed the American soldier. What began as mild irritation at their inexperience had grown into a genuine respect, a respect forged under fire, in days where the Americans refused to be beaten again. After their first encounter, Rommel expected the Americans to fall back, regroup, maybe dig in defensively. They did not. Instead, they moved forward. U.S. infantry units advanced across the harsh terrain with confidence, supported by synchronized artillery that shadowed their every step. Rommel's Afrika Korps watched them push through sandstorms and blistering heat, never hesitating, never slowing. The clumsy soldiers of Kasserine seemed to have vanished. One battle remained especially burned into Rommel's memory. Near Machnesee, German scouts spotted a series of American positions spread across a ridge. In the past, the battles that followed El Getter marked a turning point not only in the North African campaign, but in the way Field Marshal Erwin Rommel viewed the American soldier. What began as mild irritation at their inexperience had grown into a genuine respect, a respect forged under fire, in days where the Americans refused to be beaten again. After their first encounter, Rommel expected the Americans to fall back, regroup, maybe dig in defensively. They did not. Instead, they moved forward. U.S. infantry units advanced across the harsh terrain with confidence, supported by synchronized artillery that shadowed their every step. Rommel's Afrika Korps watched them push through sandstorms and blistering heat, never hesitating, never slowing. The clumsy soldiers of Kasserine seemed to have vanished. One battle remained especially burned into Rommel's memory. Near Machnesee, German scouts spotted a series of American positions spread across a ridge. In the past, Americans had built defensive lines that were easy to flank or disrupt. But this ridge was different. It had overlapping fields of fire, communication trenches, and well-camouflaged foxholes. Everything about it suggested a calculating, methodical mind behind the design. When Rommel ordered a probing attack, the response was immediate and brutal. Machine guns opened at precise intervals. Mortars tracked German movement with unsettling accuracy. And when German infantry tried to push through the gaps, they were met by American riflemen who stood their ground without panic. Rommel studied the battlefield through his binoculars, feeling something he had not expected: acknowledgement. "They're learning faster than any army I've seen," he muttered. But the Americans did more than hold, they counterattacked. It was a small action, but symbolic. When German forces fell back to reorganize, American infantry surged forward, taking the initiative. They moved with confidence, not recklessness, coordinating with armor and air support. Their Sherman tanks rolled up the ridge, firing steadily as their crews communicated with surprising discipline. Rommel, who had always admired boldness, recognized the shift instantly. "These men fight with purpose now," he said quietly to his staff. The ultimate test came days later, when German armor attempted a breakout. The Americans met them with a wall of artillery fire unlike anything Rommel expected. Shells rained down with terrifying consistency, creating a curtain of explosions that forced his panzers to halt. Forward observers adjusted fire with breathtaking speed, tracking even the slightest change in German movement. Rommel watched the scene in silence. The late afternoon sun over Tunisia cast long shadows across the hills when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood beside his command car, binoculars resting against his chest. The campaign had changed. He could feel it as clearly as the desert wind. Weeks earlier, the Americans were disorganized, inexperienced, and easy to break. Now something was different, something he could not ignore. Reports came in from the front. American artillery firing with new precision, units maneuvering with discipline, and tank crews coordinating attacks with a confidence he had not seen before. Rommel had spent years fighting the British, and he respected them deeply. But the soldiers he faced now were neither British nor the same Americans he had crushed at Kasserine Pass. They were something new. He stepped onto a ridge where his aides had set up a temporary observation point. Dust clouds rose over the horizon. American Shermans, moving in formation, followed closely by infantry who advanced with steady, measured steps. No panic, no hesitation. They used cover intelligently, pushing his Afrika Korps back one ridge at a time. Rommel watched silently as a German anti-tank crew fired at the leading Sherman. The shell struck, but the tank didn't halt. Instead, it angled sharply, avoiding the next round. A second Sherman flanked the German gun, firing with devastating accuracy. The position was overrun in minutes. Rommel exhaled slowly. "These are not the same men," he murmured. Earlier in the war, he had seen American units scatter at the sight of German armor. Their officers were unsure, their logistics clumsy, their battlefield communication chaotic. But after Kasserine, General Eisenhower had reorganized everything: command structure, supply lines, training, and leadership. Now, Rommel found himself facing an army that learned faster than he expected, faster than he thought possible. As the battle intensified, American fighter bombers screamed across the sky, dropping bombs with precision that disrupted German movements. Rommel's radio crackled with urgent messages: units withdrawing, fuel shortages worsening, casualties rising. Every decision he made now was reactive, not decisive. The initiative had shifted. For the first time in North Africa, Rommel felt the weight of inevitability. The Americans pressed forward relentlessly, their attacks coordinated hour after hour. Their logistics, once laughably disorganized, now delivered ammunition and fuel faster than his Afrika Korps could counter. Their artillery blanketed the field with a devastating consistency that reminded him of the Russians on the Eastern Front. And their infantry, young, determined, resilient, kept advancing no matter how many counterattacks were thrown at them. By nightfall, Rommel stood once more at his command table, reviewing the day's reports. Losses were heavy. Positions taken months ago were now abandoned. The Americans were not just fighting well, they were fighting like veterans. General Bayerlein approached him quietly. "Herr Feldmarschall, shall we prepare for another counterattack tomorrow?" Rommel shook his head. "No, they have learned too much. They adapt too quickly." He looked out toward the distant flashes of American artillery, lighting the horizon like distant lightning. "When we first met them," he said softly, "they were unprepared boys. Now—" He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a man who rarely spoke without purpose. "Now they are soldiers, dangerous ones." In that moment, Rommel understood what many German officers still refused to admit. The United States, with its industry, manpower, and rapidly maturing army, would soon become the dominant force on the battlefield. And once they did, there would be no stopping them. It was his final judgment, shaped not by pride or propaganda, but by the brutal clarity of experience. The Americans had earned his respect the only way a soldier truly can, in fire, in defeat, and in undeniable transformation.